Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, arrived at Paris Airport for a diplomatic visit to France, which seemed like a normal trip at first, but no one expected it to turn into a historic moment with global impact. He was supposed to stay a few days in Paris before heading to other European countries to talk about economic partnerships in Africa, but the moment he stepped into the airport, things went off track. At the security checkpoint, instead of following normal diplomatic protocol, a security officer treated him like a regular traveler and stopped him for questioning. At first, the situation didn't seem serious, but it quickly turned into an international issue as Traoré's security team rushed to explain and get proper clearance from airport officials, yet things got worse fast. Even though Ibrahim Traoré handled the disrespect calmly and with dignity, French diplomats scrambled to fix the situation they never expected, but by then, it was already too late because the incident had been recorded by other passengers and was soon all over social media and TV. The videos showed Traoré's calm and serious face compared to the casual behavior of the security officer. While French embassy staff looked visibly stressed, around the world, people saw the contrast and realized this wasn't just about one leader being disrespected, but a moment that could spark a major diplomatic conflict, and tension grew in the airport as more passengers recognized the president of Burkina Faso. Whispers spread through the crowd as many French citizens felt embarrassed by how a visiting president was treated on their own soil, and as the news broke, journalists waiting to cover President Traoré's arrival quickly began filming the scene. The security officer, realizing his mistake too late, looked nervous and overwhelmed just as senior officials rushed over, with the airport's chief of security stepping forward and saying, "Mr. President, please accept our deepest apologies for this misunderstanding," while reaching out his hand, but the harm had already been done. Traoré gave a slight nod, his face calm and unreadable, and said quietly, "I understand mistakes happen, but one must wonder if this is truly a mistake or a reflection of something deeper," and his words, heavy with meaning, sent a chill through those close enough to hear, because it wasn't just what he said, but the calm, composed way he said it that made the officer's behavior look even worse. Meanwhile, in a nearby office, French Foreign Ministry officials were making urgent calls as the incident had already reached the Élysée Palace where the French president was being briefed. What was supposed to be a simple state visit to strengthen ties with Burkina Faso was now turning into a full-blown diplomatic crisis, and the foreign minister barked, "We need damage control and we need it now. Give me the president's office and find out who was responsible for this security failure." Back at the airport, Traoré's security team had formed a protective circle around him while French officials finally showed up to escort him to his waiting motorcade, but the president didn't rush. He stood calmly, watching the scene his presence had ignited, when a young French journalist managed to reach him and asked, "President Traoré, how do you feel about your treatment by French security?" And he looked her straight in the eyes and said in a clear, strong voice that echoed through the silent hall, "What happened to me today is not about Ibrahim Traoré. It's about the relationship between Europe and Africa, about respect, or the lack of it, and maybe most of all, about whether we truly live in the post-colonial world we say we do." Then turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a stunned crowd, and by the time he reached his hotel in central Paris, the entire world had seen the footage. Traoré in Paris was trending globally, with millions sharing the video and weighing in on what it meant. What could have been handled as a small diplomatic mistake had now grown too big to ignore, especially in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, where citizens began gathering in the streets with a mix of anger and pride, angry that their president had been disrespected, but proud of the calm and dignified way he responded, with many people holding up handmade signs that read things like "Respect Burkina Faso" and "No More Colonial Attitudes." What happened at Paris Airport quickly turned from a local mishap into a global scandal, as media and social platforms highlighted that this wasn't just an insult to President Traoré, but a serious diplomatic issue that could shake France's relationship with West Africa. French politicians and journalists reacted fast. Some condemned the treatment as completely unacceptable and warned of possible damage to international relations, while others tried to downplay it as a simple security mix-up. But viral videos online showed just how serious the moment was, with many users pointing out that the issue wasn't only about racism, but also revealed deep, long-standing frustration among African nations toward France and the broader Western world. It became clear that the event wasn't just a personal slight, and the French government's initial apology, though swift, felt too shallow for many people who believed the situation wasn't being taken seriously enough. By evening, the story was leading headlines across the globe, with political experts and international relations analysts weighing in, including Dr. Amina Dio from Sciences Po, who said, "What we're seeing here is a catalyst." President Traoré's experience has triggered long-brewing tensions between France and its former colonies, and the question now is whether this sparks honest dialogue or a worsening of relations. Back at his hotel, President Traoré met with his advisors to plan their next move, as the French Foreign Ministry had issued a formal apology and now offered a private meeting with the French president the following day, though it was clear that much more would be needed to truly mend the damage. In the morning, President Traoré's chief of staff gave him a quiet update before the official welcome ceremony, saying that off the record, French officials were calling the incident a regrettable misunderstanding and putting all the blame on a junior security officer who supposedly failed to recognize him and follow proper diplomatic protocol, to which Traoré nodded thoughtfully and, with a faint smile, replied, "Convenient," then asked, "And how are people reacting back home?" His chief of staff responded that the public was outraged, with spontaneous protests erupting in support of him and even the political opposition releasing statements condemning France's disrespect. Across the African continent, similar responses were building. Presidents from Ghana, Senegal, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire had all called to express solidarity, and the African Union was preparing an official statement. Standing by the window and gazing at the sparkling Paris skyline, Traoré said, "We have an opportunity here, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa," and as his advisors watched silently, he continued, "For too long, we've accepted the status quo in our relationships with former colonial powers. We talk about partnership, but the attitudes beneath the surface haven't changed. Maybe this incident can finally be a wake-up call." Within hours, diplomatic relations between Burkina Faso and France grew tense, and while French officials scrambled to contain the fallout, countries across Africa began reevaluating their ties with France, a reaction deeply rooted in historical grievances and long-standing frustrations. Many world leaders criticized France, defending the dignity and rights of African nations, while President Traoré's calm but firm stance earned him admiration not just in Burkina Faso but across the continent. Many diplomatic analysts said his response marked the beginning of a shift in power dynamics between the West and Africa, inspiring leaders in other African countries to stand more firmly for respect and equality. The next morning in Paris was bright and clear, but the diplomatic mood remained heavy, as the French president agreed to meet with Traoré privately at the Élysée Palace before their public appearance in an effort to calm tensions. The two met in a quiet salon, away from cameras, where the French president greeted him warmly, clasping his hand and saying sincerely, "Mr. President, please allow me to express my personal regret for yesterday's unfortunate incident. It does not reflect the respect France holds for you or for Burkina Faso," to which Traoré responded with polite firmness, "I appreciate your words, Mr. President, but I must be honest, what happened yesterday goes beyond me personally. It struck a nerve across the entire African continent." The French president frowned slightly and asked, "Surely you don't believe there was any intentional disrespect," explaining that it was simply a regrettable error by a junior officer who had already been disciplined. But Traoré responded calmly, "Intentional or not, it has revealed attitudes many believe still exist beneath the surface, and maybe that's what we should be discussing today, rather than the economic agreements we had planned," causing the French president to shift uncomfortably. Realizing this meeting was going in a direction he hadn't anticipated, trying to recover, he said, "Of course, we can discuss any concerns you have about our relationship. France values its partnerships in Africa," to which Traoré repeated thoughtfully, "Partnership, an interesting word. It implies equality, mutual respect, shared goals. Is that truly what we have? Or is it something else?" And before the French president could respond, an aide entered with an urgent message. Protests had erupted overnight in front of French embassies in several African capitals, and in Burkina Faso, demonstrators were demanding a reassessment of all agreements with France. The incident at Paris Airport had now grown far beyond a bilateral issue. It had become a global flashpoint, and while the French government issued a formal apology under pressure from the media and public, their response was seen as too little, too late. Across Africa, nations inspired by Traoré's strength began demanding that Western powers confront their colonial pasts and respect African sovereignty, with West African countries especially using this moment to push harder for economic and diplomatic independence. The shock of what happened in Paris sent ripples through the world, permanently affecting France's foreign policy and reshaping international relationships. As the day unfolded, the story dominated headlines. Political cartoonists worldwide drew images of Traoré standing tall while Western powers cowered. And social media was filled with memes comparing colonial-era imagery to his dignified reaction. In academic circles, scholars began analyzing the deeper meaning behind the event, with Dr. Kofi Mensah from the University of Ghana writing a powerful editorial stating, "What happened at Paris Airport is significant not because it is exceptional, but because it made visible what is usually invisible, the persistent inequality in relations between former colonial powers and African nations," calling President Traoré's response a moment of clarity that many hoped would spark real change. By mid-afternoon, the joint press conference between the French president and Traoré had become one of the most highly anticipated political events in recent history, with reporters from around the world packed into the Élysée Palace and millions watching live streams. The French president spoke first, repeating his apology and emphasizing France's commitment to true partnership with Africa, carefully choosing his words in hopes of damage control. And when Traoré stepped up to the microphone, the room fell completely silent, all eyes on the man who had come to symbolize a turning point in global diplomacy, standing with the same calm strength he had shown since the incident. "Thank you, Mr. President, for your words," Traoré began, his voice steady and clear. "I accept your apology on behalf of Burkina Faso, but I stand here today not just for my country, but for the hopes and frustrations of an entire continent." And as he looked directly into the cameras, he continued, "What happened yesterday has started a much-needed conversation, because for too long, the relationship between Africa and its former colonizers has been built on polite illusions. We speak of partnership while quietly accepting subtle and not-so-subtle reminders of inequality. We talk about cooperation while living with policies that often put European interests ahead of African progress." And though the French president maintained a neutral expression, a faint muscle twitch in his jaw betrayed his discomfort as Traoré went on. "I propose we don't waste this moment on blame, but use it for honest reflection. Let us recognize the past, yes, but more importantly, let us reimagine a future where African nations are true partners, where our resources benefit our people first, and where our sovereignty is unquestioned," prompting applause to break out, first from African journalists and then from their European counterparts. While the French president joined in with a forced smile as the press conference ended, it was clear that what began as a moment of personal disrespect had become a platform for Africa's collective voice. And when the two leaders shook hands for the cameras, it was Traoré who clearly stood in the position of strength. In the days that followed, the Paris airport incident continued to make waves globally, with the hashtag #RespectAfrica trending across social media as people shared stories of discrimination and demanded change, while African diaspora communities held protests in major cities, calling for a rethinking of global relationships. In the business world, African entrepreneurs began questioning their ties with European companies and pushed for fairer deals. And some high-profile figures even canceled trips to Europe in a show of solidarity. The cultural response was powerful too, with artists producing songs, poetry, and visual art inspired by Traoré's dignity. One Senegalese fashion designer even launched a collection called Diplomatic Immunity that reimagined traditional African fabrics as elegant diplomatic wear. African politicians, feeling the pressure from their citizens, began taking firmer stances in international discussions. And even leaders known for their close European ties started shifting their rhetoric toward independence. In Europe, the response was divided. Progressive politicians and civil groups welcomed the call for change and began hosting forums on how to build fairer partnerships with Africa, while conservative voices pushed back, seeing it as an attack on European pride. 1 week after the incident, the African Union held an emergency session that was meant to last 1 day but stretched into 3. As leaders across Africa debated how to use this momentum, and the result was the historic Paris Declaration, a bold new vision for international relations that called for renegotiating unequal treaties, demanded stronger African voices in global institutions, and created new systems to support unity and independence across the continent.